This one I'll title Establishment Necessary and Proper. Our next lecture will focus more on our Protestant and American context. That's why I switched the titles. The last lecture, if you remember, we considered several things: the nature and necessity of law for men, and in turn the necessity and origins of government as lawmaking authorities suited to govern reasonable creatures. Our Q&A, if you also remember that, went deeper into some of those things. I was very pleased by that, namely whether government would have existed for prelapsarian man. I thought that was a lot of fun, at least for me, maybe not you. I talked in the first lecture, the very first one going back to September or whenever it was, among other things about how law must recognize and incorporate man's anthropology. This was highlighted again in the second lecture also. Law and jurists who interpret, construct, and apply it, meaning law, must be cognizant of the subjects it governs, namely the human person, his reasonability and sociability. But not only this, for this is not all man is. He's not just body and brain, but body and soul. He possesses a sense of divinity. He is religious. And this too has implications for government as lawmaking, remember, nomethetical authority, this authority and power to make law. This means that law must acknowledge, accommodate, and incorporate this attribute and end of man as much as it must accord with his given biological nature, his body, his material existence. That is, if the law is to address the whole man and not merely subrational beasts. Now, returning briefly to basics, all power is of God, and this includes government, the lawmaking authority. The source of this power dictates its character and aims, and on the front end, just as its operation is dictated by the nature of the subjects in view. Scripture charges governing authorities to chastise evil and promote good. Quote, "For the maintaining of righteousness and judgment, therefore, in the earth is government set up." That's what Jonathan Todd preached in 1749. The common and public good is the aim, and God's grant of authority is for our good, not our ill. But the question emerges in this: what is the extent of the good, and how far can it be promoted, and of what kind? We might be tempted to think it is unique to our day that many Westerners, both atheists and Christians, insist that this good in view is necessarily limited to material considerations, that civil authority is limited in its action by a material harm principle and must justify its actions on the basis of a sanitized, consensus, irreligious public reason. Both are innovative, liberal, democratic, meaning in the technical sense, not a partisan sense yet, convictions fueled by a decidedly modern and limited conception of man, law, and government. Again, even Christians baptize these truisms and uninterrogated assumptions. But this question is in fact not new. Again, the forgotten 18th century New England preacher Jonathan Todd, mentioned already, recalled that in mid-century, meaning 18th century Connecticut, quote, "There hath indeed been a great cry of late years that the civil magistrate hath nothing to do about religious matters, nor ought to make laws for the encouragement of religion and protection of the Church of Christ." He wasn't Church of Christ, you know what he means. That is, a rejection, at least as normative, of Isaiah 49:23, the magistrates should be nursing fathers to religion, true religion, and a narrow reading also here of Romans 13, contrary to the testimony of the consensus of Protestant confessions from the Gallican to Helvetic to Irish to English, not to mention our favorite theologians that we always rely on for our other doctrinal formulations. Somehow here they're wrong and just didn't think hard enough about it. But this was not just an 18th century New England problem, so it's not just an American problem. Richard Hooker addressed it in the Elizabethan era as well. Quote, "A gross error it is to think that the regal power," and if you remember in the last lecture we talked about the regal power, as Baxter also refers to it, as being synonymous with the nomethetical power that Hale constructs, the lawmaking power. Quoting again, "It ought to serve for the good of the body and not of the soul." That's the error. "For men's temporal peace and not for their eternal safety, as if God had ordained kings for no other purpose and ends but only to fat up men like hogs and to see that they have their mast." Richard Baxter dealt with the same issue a century later. Quote, "We detest their doctrine who debase kings and magistrates by saying that they are governors only of the body and not of the soul, when it is only souls that are commanded by laws and immediately obey, or that it is only the civil peace and bodily prosperity which is the end of government of kings, and not men's spiritual good and salvation. And so that the king and magistrates are to be valued as much less than the clergy, as concerns of the body are less valuable than the concerns of the soul. In other words, Baxter's saying, while the full secularization of government is a relatively recent innovation, this question has perennial presence. Now notice what Baxter is doing. He's appealing back to the definition of law we established last time. Only creatures with reasonable faculties and souls can be governed by law. In fact, it demands it. Law by its nature is already an appeal to the soul and an invitation to participate in divine reason unto true justice among men and to God. Therefore, a lawgiver is always and already engaging the soul. How could he neglect the good of the thing to which he appeals in his statutes? This power and activity, this exchange among reasonable creatures, is not relegated to purely material realms. From the second nomethetical power, acts, the spiritual world is entered. The nomethetical power is not limited to merely external things, as some would insist. So here's Baxter again. The power of magistrates is both internal and external, for they govern both mind and body. For there is no ruling of men's bodies by laws unless they first rule the mind. For laws force not the locomotive power immediately. And so pastors have both external and internal power also, because by God's word they rule first the mind, and by that the body, as to forbear sin and worship God, etc. Law itself, even backed by punishment and coercion, does not and cannot force the locomotive power of man, as Baxter puts it. It is inherently an appeal not to the body, but to the mind and to the soul. Action follows. Man may, of course, comply with legal dictates, not out of genuine conviction and assent, as we might hope, but this fact of disingenuous compliance does not negate the nature of what's going on here. But just because the law appeals to the internal life of man does not by itself mean on that basis that it must address the internal concerns of man. But of course, such a limitation only makes sense if the good to be pursued by the nomethetical power is limited in its own nature and authority to material things. True, the coercive power of punishment that backs human law is limited to external application. But again, what we already have established about man, his spiritual interest, his religious nature and eternal end makes it difficult, perhaps unjust, to govern him well without concern for his soul, and it is impossible to govern him at all without appealing to his soul. And a soul ill-informed or uninstructed is unlikely to embrace even good law. There is therefore an interest also for the nomethetical power in soul cultivation and orientation in its subjects. In other words, law is always soulcraft. And in a very real sense, law, good law, prepares man for the acceptance of higher truths insofar as it appeals to higher law and true human good. Returning to the authority and purpose of government directly, if governing authority is charged with the good of a soulful creature, he must care for the soul. Care cannot be accomplished by falsehood. That is definitionally unjust both to God and man. Promotion of true religion, the religion of the source of the authority in the nomethetical power, is the only just option. But let us assume for a minute that you're not quite convinced of this necessity. Perhaps you will be of its inevitability. Even misguided governing authority performs the function we speak of, often in spite of itself and in contradiction of its stated principles. No regime is truly godless. Something always fills that void as a source of moral religious appeal to the soul and to establish nomethetical weight and conviction. Justification for exercise of power is also needed by men. And it is right and good that all governments do this. Even if they are misguided in the object, they are right in principle as to the nature of man and law. For this reason, William Prynne remarked that all kings punish blasphemy and heresy. It's just a question of which, not whether. A pagan can still possess transcendent zeal, as he called it. For as the very light of nature instructs all nations that there is a God and instigates them to elect and adore some deity or other as their God and Savior. Again, it's which, not whether, quoting Prynne. So it further instructs them, meaning the light of nature, that the deity they adore and that religion they embrace is no ways to be openly blasphemed, reviled, contemned under pain of the most severe capital punishments, because such offenses against the supremest majesty of God transcends any treason against an earthly sovereignty, whence most laws and nations have made them capital, meaning capital punishments or crimes, and by the light of nature in all ages punish such whom they esteemed atheists, heretics, blasphemers of their gods, and any violator of their established religion, with no less than capital punishments and the severest censures as is evident by these scripture instances and sundry other. He had just gotten done citing Nebuchadnezzar. This is why Plato condemned those to be put to death who are violators or corrupters of religion. This is why Solon advocated war against those who defiled the temple of Delphus. Aversion to public impiety and blasphemy is ingrained in us. We recognize it attacks the fabric of society, the basis of law, and moreover invites unrest, the latter being the stated rationale by common law courts in this country for punishing open blasphemy. To print again, whence I conclude that what pagan kings, magistrates, nations have usually punished with corporal or capital punishments and restrained by civil laws in all ages out of the light of nature, that Christian kings, magistrates, and nations under the gospel may lawfully punish in like sort, even by the principles of nature too, but had they no other divine law to warrant them, as they have. 'Tis true, most of these erred in the object, in deeming that heresy, schism, blasphemy, error, which was not in the punishment, but in the object, been such that they really deemed it, and such we hear dispute of. So to recap, protection of the central civil cult is perennial, if only for socio-political reasons, if only informed by the light of nature. Pagans have always done it, and our own increasingly pagan regime does it too. Public displays encourage certain religious fidelity, and destruction of such temples is punished harshly. We add to this what we earlier discussed, namely the nomethetical authority conducive to man's being and good, which comes from God. That his true worship, being for the good of man and honor of God himself, be promoted in an inescapable conclusion, is an inescapable conclusion given also by law's appeal to the soul and the natural civil instinct to protect worship of some deity. Pagans know this, we avoid this to our chagrin. So government cannot limit its consideration of the material. Law necessarily engages the mind and soul, not just the body. It would be strange to say that law and its appeal to the soul can only pertain to things of the body. The good of man is found not just in his physical well-being, but in his heavenly end. And all societies require and indeed possess a religious establishment, a deity and morality of some kind that undergirds its political activity and collective life. A secular neutrality is simply not available nor desirable. It is literally an inhuman prospect. When you hear secular today, simply translate it as anti-Christian. Think paganism. That nature of man and law has not been effectively negated in our day, only reoriented. But if we will not worship the transcendent being, we will worship a transcendent psychologized self, our own psyche. If we would kill God, we must become gods. The nation has not been disestablished, only reestablished. Blasphemy does not go unpunished, only a different deity is in view. Worship is not discouraged, only a different kind is promoted, indeed coerced. It is a liberal lie that any other arrangement is possible, one spun to get Christians to stifle their imaginations and magistrates to abdicate their nomethetical duty. All that said, we have only been speaking descriptively thus far, and of things in principle. Good governance is always itself governed by prudence, a recognition of sin and finitude, namely that we're not God. No model has yet been proposed here. Establishment, though perennial, is in its mechanisms of application and enforcement, much like property, best conceived as a bundle of sticks. Diversity of models is possible based on the relative homogeneity and condition of the people that comprise the nation. And next time we'll devote our attention to the American context, its history and possible future as a model. Until then, we'll open it up to discussion.
Okay, I'll ask a couple questions. We do not have microphones, but we will be opening it up to you, and we'll have a good amount of time for questions. And of course, this is a massive, this could run in a lot of different directions when it comes to what does God mean through the prophet Isaiah and Isaiah 49:23. You quoted this verse in passing, so I figured I would read it and then just and ask you one particular question after reading it. Okay, so this is Isaiah 49. I'll start in verse 22 to get the context. It says, "Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will lift up mine hand to the Gentiles, and set up my standard to the people, and they shall bring thy sons in their arms, and thy daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders, and kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and their queens thy nursing mothers. They shall bow down to thee with their face toward the earth, and lick up the dust of thy feet. And thou shalt know that I am the Lord, for they shall not be ashamed that wait for me." So kings shall be thy nursing fathers, queens thy nursing mothers has been used by the Reformed tradition to say that civil authorities actually have to look to the welfare of the church. Given that that is a radical concept for many in America today, what would you say is a minimal standard in order to have both this text of Scripture fulfilled, and what is a minimal standard in order to say, well, that is at least a soft establishment?
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. I think we could say broad strokes, it's talking about recognition of true religion and the true church, right? So it can't simply lick the dust of everybody's feet. It has to have some recognition, and it does have the ability to do this. Many people object here that this requires some kind of doctrinal discernment out of the civil authority, which is true. So it must recognize it, and it must promote and protect it in its operation so that it can do what the church is supposed to do. This is both important for the magistrate, the king, let's just say king, it's way cooler. The king's own rule, he has to have, as I said, a central civic cult. It should be the true one. It's good for his people, both their souls and their temporal well-being, and it justifies or is justice to God as the source of his authority. So it's good for him to do. He should recognize it. He should protect it so the church is not persecuted, and he should elevate the church as the source of public morality.
Okay, so the king's supposed to protect the church, and I imagine some people might be asking the question, from what? Like the Methodists?
And you should always protect the church from enthusiasms. Yes. Yes.
It sounds. This sounds like a dicey. This sounds like a dicey proposition.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll get into the American context next time, which is I think many prudential adjustments and accommodations are made in the American context to come to terms with from their perspective, extreme diversity of denominations on the ground. Essentially, when you're talking about in that context, some kind of freedom of religion, it's freedom of denominations, particularly in a state context to sort of orchestrate it the way they want to. But if you're limiting the scope to your states at that point, I mean, you're just sort of kicking the can to a different geographic area. So at some point, the rubber does have to meet the road, and you're going to have to choose, which denomination you want to promote the most. Some, try to get around this by just promoting general Protestantism because they have a sufficiently small pool, of denominations involved. So if you just had Presbyterians and Congregationalists, you can probably work that out. But you get what I'm getting at.
Okay. If maybe back up one step from that particular conversation, which would be civil leaders themselves. Can you have a soft establishment if the civil leaders themselves are unbaptized?
Unbaptized. Why do you say unbaptized specifically? Just that they're not in the church?
Pagan.
Okay, just pagan. Yeah, I mean, the Reform would say it's every magistrate's duty to care for the church, even if they're not in it. This is just inherent in the duty. I would say that we should, in any good polity, you would promote and limit your leadership to those that are baptized and true Christians, at least that can fake it. That's good enough for civil purposes. But they can still protect the church, and they should. Now, there is a recognition that if you live in a hostile regime, you can't expect as much from the civil authority as you could in an otherwise Christian one. And you are going to have to make practical adjustments as the church in this regard. But we're talking about the ideal here, in principle, how it should work, and you make your practical adjustments later.
I'll make one final, just an observation, and then we'll open it up for questions. In I believe it was your first lecture, you said originalism is not enough when it comes to lawmaking. So just claiming, well, that's the original intent of the law is not enough if the original intent is not grounded upon a God's law, whether that be divine law or natural law. It has to be grounded on this higher order. And it sounds like you're saying something similar here, that the state itself, the civil order itself, also cannot just pop out of thin air. It can't be created out of the imagination of the human. It must have some kind of reference to the Creator who has revealed how it ought to operate.
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's just objectively true that that is where the authority comes from, is from God. It's not true that pagan governments are illegitimate in the sense that they can't be recognized, but a true and good government, a commonwealth deserving of the name, has to be one that's oriented to God and recognizes, in a sort of cohesive and comprehensible way, the source of its authority and the ends and aims of its government as well as its subjects for their good. So that's the ideal. It doesn't mean you have a right necessarily, there could be debate on this, to rebel against a pagan government just because it's pagan. It can still be legitimate. Of course, everyone kind of recognizes this as well. And so, the authority is objective, whether it's recognized or not. The authority or the rationale for law is objective, whether it's recognized or not. The comments on originalism are just to say that a certain jurisprudential approach to interpretation is insufficient is exposed as insufficient because of the challenges we now face. It's not that there's not a place for divining sort of the intent of a law to do what it's supposed to do from the initial legislators. But that's not sufficient, especially when you meet sort of metaphysical and fundamental challenges that are willing to also disregard the intent or the ostensible intent and insert whatever they want. And so you always have to have, at least in the background, some sense of where this authority is coming from and the nature of the things you're lawmaking for. Jeff and I were talking about this the other night, the Alabama IVF case. The special concurrence from the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court sort of has this great maneuver where he's going to find a textual hook, because that's what people need, right? They kind of want this, but then he uses it to be able to insert the authority of God, the nature of the human person, and these things. So he's doing it in a clever but good way. I would say that's a model kind of what I'm talking about.
Okay. All right, with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Many Christians balk at the idea of obscenity and blasphemy laws. Nomothetical authority aside, how do you plan on convincing the everyday Christian that blasphemy or obscenity laws are a good idea?
Okay. In part, that they just happen, so you have to choose what kind of blasphemy you want to punish. And which one I would prefer to punish blasphemy against Christianity than of blasphemy against it itself is blasphemy against any other competitor. But to convince, this is a very democratic question. I don't like this kind of thing. I don't need mass consensus on this. But I think reasoning with people about the consensus of our tradition expressed through the confessions and our theologians, as well as its the fact that this is indigenous to our own country, not that long ago, is perfectly sufficient. If it's not, I'm not really sure what to do with people, because on the one hand, it's inevitable, it is happening, it always happens, and then two, the Christian variety of this is rooted in our own tradition. So if you're going to choose how this is going to be expressed, and again, we'll talk about these sort of models and how you can cut this later, but I think it needs to be a Christian one. It's been good to our society in general, and so I think even some secular atheist people recognize this, and this seems like a sufficient case to me, but maybe it's not.
What holds government accountable to actually enforce true religion in the event, and not heresy in the event that they say that they're Christian but promote or even enforce unorthodox doctrine?
So what keeps the government from doing bad things?
What holds them accountable in areas of Christian?
Oh, yes, I see. Okay, so, this is part of what I would say is the proper relationship between church and state, which is the church, is charged as a sort of coordinate state with the state itself, the civil authority, to provide a prophetic witness and instruction to not just the magistrates themselves, but to the people. And that in a proper orientation or relationship, the state should, in general, defer to the doctrinal considerations there. That's how it's supposed to work. There's always these kinds of things. John Norton does this in his the answer to William Apollonius in the 17th century, and just says, just as the magistrate, the Christian magistrate, must correct the church, sort of restore it to its final pristine point if it goes off the rails, which you have to be able to say if you're Protestant, by the way. Otherwise, all this is bunk. We have no Reformation. The magistrate has to be able to do this, and then they'll just kind of say, and the church has to correct the magistrate if he goes off the rails. But it never gives you how do you do that, because short of taking up arms or something, it'd be tough at some point. But that's how it's supposed to work. And the tools of the church are obviously its prophetic witness and teaching, and we trust the rest of the Spirit, is what I'd say.
Anecdotally, I find it very interesting in our own recent past, Nancy Pelosi, who I believe is a Roman Catholic, there was at least a threat, a rattling of the saber from a priest in California to suspend her from the table because of her actions. And so, whatever one might think of that, there you are, at least an example of something even recently that could happen along those lines.
She should be suspended from much more, but than the table. Okay. There was one more over here.
You mentioned that we should be comfortable with magistrates merely being nominally Christian, but it seems like one of the biggest problems with our legislation is that for centuries our governments have called themselves Christian and have really dirtied the name of Christian. So how can we as Christians be comfortable with legislators nominally using the name while at the same time really dirtying it if we are seeking to reform and hold a higher standard?
You should suspend them from the table. And you should, so when I say nominal Christian, I'm saying on this plane of analysis, I don't care to look into the souls of the magistrate. For the purposes of this, I don't care whether they really believe it or not. I just need them to act like they do. And some of what you're talking about is them not acting like they do, or not acting in accordance with the good of the church and the good of Christianity, of Christendom. So I just need them to actually seek the benefit of the church, and the church is the one that can consider, the state of their soul. So that's what I mean when I say nominal. Not, in this sense, they need to be doing everything that makes you think they're a Christian. But my only point there is to not care about their ultimate salvation for these purposes.
On a similar note to the question before, I imagine that the magistrate's going to have to make some determinations about which doctrines are far enough away from orthodoxy that they should be considered dangerous, and which are maybe not correct, but close enough to orthodoxy that it's not going to make a big difference. So my question is, how does he make these decisions? Does he decide himself, in which case he seems to be basically a default ecclesiastical officer, or does he listen to a denomination to tell him, in which case, which one does he pick, which denomination within his realm? It seems to be that he still ultimately has to become the default ecclesiastical officer in order to make those choices.
Yeah, for some reason, I think we talked a little bit about this last time. There is a sense in which he does have a sort of ecclesial office, if you want to describe it that way, because he does ultimately make the decision. Now, I think there should be deference to synodical authority in their ruling according to doctrine. You see this, throughout church history. There's a huge kind of issue in the church, and the magistrate is like, call a synod and sort it out because it's annoying me, and I need you to fix it. It's causing problems. So we certainly don't want the magistrate to capture the keys. We don't want him to take over discipline or administration of the sacraments or the preaching. But to deny that the magistrate or the civil authority has any kind of ecclesial sense or doctrinal wherewithal, I think is faulty. It's too clean. Ultimately, the magistrate does have to, in this sense, decide which one are we going to pick. There's also a question of relevance here. I mean, is the magistrate super interested in the doctrine of justification or atonement as we debate these? Not too much, as long as it doesn't cause a big problem where there's all these factions fighting. He's chiefly interested in the civil expression of these things, and that's why you see most of the focus on things like open reviling of Christ and his divinity. That's just a problem. Is he there deciding the bounds of orthodoxy over and against Arians in a sense? Yeah, he definitely is. But it's also not like we're getting into nitty-gritty theological conceptions here. I mean, it's pretty basic. And there's only a basic level of it really needed for the cohesion of society, but it does require some kind of ruling organ on the ecclesiastical side to be present, in my opinion. I don't think there's a way around that. Well, I don't know your name, obviously, so just you, yes.
Given that this style of government seems to be headed toward a sort of legislation of morality, how do we stop this from devolving into a sort of pharisaical legalism, where even the smallest trespasses against the law result in great punishment?
I'm not sure I understand the question all the way. If you want to think, I mean, I don't think it's pharisaical to legislate morality and to punish violations of the law, and we always legislate morality. I think we should legislate Christian morality. I think we were discussing before, if you have a large degree of agreement and homogeneity in your society, there's a sense in which you can afford, and in fact it might be desirable to have a certain degree of liberality with each other. Not everything has to be spelled out all the time. But you do have to have mechanisms in place that maintain that homogeneity and agreement, and I would say that's probably a fault of our society, as we did not have that sufficiently, in my opinion. Over here, closer. Yeah.
How would you distinguish this from like Thomas Hooker's Erastianism, where the head of the state is ultimately the head of the church? And would you?
Thomas Hooker in Connecticut? Richard Hooker?
Would you distinguish this from Erastianism?
Okay, just Erastianism. Right. So the problem with Erastianism is not, one, they're all lawyers, so I'm kind of partial to them. They know how to govern. They're like born bureaucrats. But the problem, I mean, that whole discussion is actually very difficult in this 17th century. But the general idea is that Erastians, the only thing they're really after is this question of discipline, right? So for the purposes of society, it might not be good or conducive to social cohesion, especially at that time, to ban people from the table or excommunicate them. So instead, we'll use civil punishment for those crimes. So you're essentially taking over discipline in a certain respect, translating it into a sort of civil punishment, so that way the unity of the church is maintained. That's much of what the debate is over. Also, a sort of, is there any kind of appeal beyond ecclesial courts, which were handling a lot more things at the time than they do now? I guess we don't have them. To what extent can the synod be questioned? Is there an avenue of appeal beyond the synod, which would then place the civil authorities over the synod in a certain sense? And then, of course, I mean, getting into sort of the oath of supremacy stuff is not a distinction for a distinctive of Erastianism, in my opinion, because there's others that recognize and defend the legitimacy of that and the monarch's position in a temporal sense over the church. So I would just say you don't give up the discipline of the church and ecclesial dealings to the civil authority. I think that's fair. I don't endorse that aspect of Erastianism. I don't know if that answers the question, but I guess we'll do next. All the way in the back, I think, was next. You're not all the way. He's all the way. You can go next. Yeah, you're good.
So, as far as I can tell, both sides of this debate are going to agree that a pagan magistrate still has civil authority. So, I think Dr. Longshore was kind of getting at this in his questions. It's taking a little bit of time to get into my head. So, for someone who argues that part of the role of the civil magistrate is to uphold true religion, it seems like for a pagan for a pagan prince to attempt to fulfill the role of magistrate but neglect half of his duties is an act in and of itself of abdication. Like, he's giving up the central role of his office by either choosing not to uphold true religion or worse, actually persecuting him. So I guess I just wondered what exactly would be the justification for saying a pagan
Yeah, I mean, it should be seen as a sign of judgment, for sure. That's how it was used to always be seen. It's certainly not desirable. It's not good. There may be a sense in which if you have a chance to alleviate yourself from that reign, you can. Baxter has this great part where he's like talking about national sovereignty, but then he's like, if there's a pagan nation that won't, well, here's what we do: we send missionaries to the pagan nation. If they kill our missionaries, then we go kill them. That's like how you work this out. So we don't need to tolerate them like doing if they won't let us preach the gospel to them to massively convert the society, it's worthy of taking it over for the sake of Christendom. So there's a sense in which, on that basis, it's certainly chipping away at their legitimacy. The point is simply that if authority comes from God, wherever it is lodged, there is an aspect of legitimacy to it, and a pagan could still perform the office of magistrate well, even as a pagan, right? So what if you have a pagan who is promoting the church and protecting the church, but he himself, is a pagan? That's not good, but he can still do it. He can still be legitimate in this sense. Other guy I shot down should be next, I think.
It was basically his question.
Okay.
He said that it's every magistrate's responsibility to protect the church, whether they're in it or not.
Mm-hmm.
But is it not their greater duty to be a converted man first? As Romans 13 says, they are servants of Christ.
Yeah.
The servants ought to obey their masters.
It's their greater personal duty, but it's not their greater public one. The public one is just simply to promote the church. They should be converted. We should demand they be baptized and bend the knee to Christ, but they can still perform their civil duty, even absent their own conviction. It kind of gets back to the point of the nominal Christian, which is all I require of citizens also in a Christian nation. I just need them to act like it, and then we'll deal with the fate of their souls in a different context. But if you're dealing with public morality and these issues of policy, we're just talking about behavior and in a certain sense external things, even as which is not to negate the fact that law appeals to the soul. Again, you can begrudgingly conform to law, even as it is working upon your soul.
I'm guessing, I'm imagining if this question was a little less abstract and we put it even in history, there probably won't be several instances of that being the case. I imagine that maybe the majority of the time, once you have established that we're a Christian land, vast majority of situations you're going to have a Christian leader.
Yeah, I think a lot of this controls for itself, but in the abstract, it's certainly possible.
Would you see like a concrete biblical example, like Cyrus encouraging the construction of the temple in Jerusalem as a pagan ruler who's not worshiping the true God, but is encouraging and endorsing what's true religion? Now, he may be doing the same thing for a bunch of pagan religions, which isn't good, but at least in that case, he's giving space, and then Nebuchadnezzar on his good days.
Right, when he's not like eating grass and stuff. It's a perfect example. That one's often cited as a venerable thing. Other ancient emperors kind of treated the Jews often the same way, for whatever reason. Either respected even the resurgence of pagan ones like Julian, respected and kind of left alone the Jews for the most part. So. I think it's a perfectly fine example. And practically speaking, you'd just be satisfied with that. You'd be like, great, this is the best we can do. He's going to fund the temple for us.
You talk about the civil magistrate or prince. How do you see this working when that power is distributed like in a republic or a constitution where the powers are shared out amongst the bodies?
Yeah, right. I think it applies, and I think constitutional monarchy is a good term because I think it's what we have. All of this applies to all of wherever authority is lodged. Ours is a particularly interesting system because I think the concentration of power ebbs and flows throughout time. So you would just say the burden is heavier on the place where it seems to be in terms of legitimacy and exertion. The most powerful at the moment. But it would apply to, this applies to any magistrate, right? This, you can't get to, and it has to, of course. This is part of the lesser magistrate doctrine, that he has to have his authority in a certain sense from God as well, even if it's delegated. It's even more interesting in our context because there's no delegation of federal power to state governors. They're not lesser magistrates. It doesn't make any sense. And so they should have this same burden in their context for their geographic, authority, the reach of their authority. So, one more.
So you mentioned a couple questions ago, homogeneity being essential to development. How would you encourage that or break from that? Because people naturally being different, especially in our modern platform world, wouldn't really be conducive to that.
Can you just repeat the last line one more time? Wouldn't be.
People in our modern world having homogeneity. How would you facilitate?
I mean, Japan does it pretty well, so it's clearly possible. And they're pretty open about it. They don't like you. They don't want you to be there. They're like, stay out, which is great. So it's certainly possible. It's obvious. It's beyond the realm of our imagination in many ways for our country. What's the how much trouble do I want to get? There's very clear causality on how this comes about, right? And a certain laxity with certain policies on how who you decide is going to live here is what creates the most of the problem. And I'm probably not even thinking what you're thinking of. I'm thinking of Catholics. So Catholic immigration creates pluralism. And then they're like, just kidding, we don't want to be in your public schools. We'll go create our own now that we've disestablished them, essentially. But in all seriousness, this is just a problem. Who you have to screen for who you're going to have to be a part of your society. There is always a question, and it's an art rather than a science, of how much change any society can take, especially in its members. And the prospect of integration and assimilation is paramount. This has always been an issue. It's not like diversity is not part of every society. That is always the case, but you have to be sensitive to what you can take, essentially. And you want people to become like you when they come here. And the extent to which you don't make them do that is the extent to which you will lose your homogeneity. And homogeneity is necessary, especially for even a classical kind of Republican model, but especially for a modern Republican model that's even more populist. It's a huge problem. So I think it's that simple. It's a question of your personnel and your citizenship, and we decided to not screen for that for a really, really long time. And so then it makes it very difficult to make everybody the same in at least a manageable sense, right? From the 18th century perspective, when the fact that you have Quakers in Pennsylvania and Congregationalists in Massachusetts means you have extreme diversity that might be problematic at scale, which seems super quaint to us now, right? So it's always a contextual question. It's somewhat relative, but the fact that we just haven't cared for a long time is why now it would be extremely difficult to change it. Well, difficult, not impossible to change. That's all I'll say.
Thanks for your talk, Mr. Cline. You said that the law appeals to the mind and the soul, and the main example that we've been using throughout has been blasphemy laws. I'm wondering in what sense exactly does a blasphemy law appeal to the mind, because it seems to me that it's still coercing external action, so you can't restrain somebody from saying false things about Jesus Christ, but you can't make them believe true things. So how is that something that appeals to the mind rather than restrains the lips?
Yeah, right. No, this is a good question. So the point on it always appealing to the soul is exactly what Baxter said. If the law itself proclaimed in speech or on the page, it can't actually do anything to restrict your body or your actions. It can't. The apparatus of coercion to enforce that law is what can restrict your external movements, right? But the law itself as a thing, it's other than on the page, is incorporeal. So the idea is law has to appeal to your mind, your reason, and your soul first to then tell you the way to move externally. Coercion is part of that latter, operation. So when we do blasphemy laws, your immediate appeal is to tell someone this is wrong because it's against the true God and the truth of Christianity. And it would be great if you would just comply with that on the basis of conviction. But even if they don't, it's still in its nature, law in its nature is an appeal to the soul in this way of you could say right and wrong, morality, whatever you want to say, but these are soul actions. These are faculties of the reasonable, soulful creature. That's why they're not suited to the governance of anyone else.
The text that comes to mind, which I just find interesting, of course, this would be in more of the family jurisdiction, but it's the same principle. Folly is bound up in the heart of the child, and the rod of reproof drives it far from him. What is that about? How does that work? You would think, well, shouldn't you only say that the word and prayer drives it far from him? Can you really say that a rod drives folly from the heart of a child? It's a very interesting world that God has made, and how what the function of law and how it trains the mind, the heart, etc.
Yeah, I was just going to verify. Sometimes it seems like one of the confusions is that we conflate. When we say law, we mean both. I think you're calling law proper, and then including within it the enforcement mechanisms, the various incentives or disincentives that we would use to accomplish obedience to that law. So the law itself is simply addressing the soul. I'm just making sure I'm tracking, because I think oftentimes the confusion comes when we say law, everybody thinks punishments are included, as opposed to saying the law itself is a declaration of obligation or something like that. And then there's a variety of ways where you can encourage obedience to it by incentivizing it. You'll get the cookie if you obey the law, or disincentivize, you get the rod if you disobey the law. But that's, in some ways, the punishments and rewards are distinct from lawmaking proper. Is that right?
I think this is basically right. I mean, I did raise some time ago, whichever one it was, that there is a question whether there's such a thing as law not backed by punishment, because God's first law to Adam and Eve is backed by punishment prior to sin's entrance to the world. So this is when we were getting into prelapsarian government, of whether someone raised, like, is this just like a suggestion bulletin board of, like, here's ideas and you guys pick what you want. And my contention was no. I mean, even if just because it's backed by punishment doesn't mean it's executed. And I think the coercion of the locomotive aspect of man is when the punishment is executed by the authorities in whatever way that's going to be. But just because it's present, either it's reward or punishment, is something to me that seems ingrained in law because it's the way God operates even from the beginning. But I think that is basically getting at the same thing.
Join me in thanking Timon Cline.